think about their commander's priority intelligence requirements. Having said that, we'll transition to strategic issues, and Nate, if you want to introduce Abe.
Thanks, Andrew. Next up is Abe Denmark. Abe is a fellow at CNAS. He directs our Asia-Pacific Security Program. Before joining us, Abe served as a China and North Korea expert in the intelligence community, and so he had to have all of his comments vetted by his former boss, but he pledges that all the good stuff wasn't stripped out. So having talked about tactical intelligence, we're going to work our way up the chain here, back to the strategic level. So, Abe.
Thanks, Nate, especially for inferring I'm up the chain from Andrew. Also, on a personal note, I'd like to note that three of my current or former bosses are on the stage with me today, so it's profound for me. I'm going to be talking about challenges in... You can't hear me? Is this better? Okay, sorry about that. I'm going to be talking about challenges in strategic intelligence analysis. Basically, talking about leadership intentions, and specifically, what does the leadership of a specific country or organization want? What are their objectives? That sort of thing. I'm going to have 4 basic points, but I'd also like to note that while my comments were vetted by my former employers, they do not reflect their views. These are my personal observations and not those of any government agency. The first challenge I'd like to highlight for strategic analysis is the need to balance clarity with incisiveness. Okay. The need to balance clarity with incisiveness. I feel like I'm at a press conference all of a sudden. Specifically, the need for clear and reasoned dissent in intelligence analysis. We've seen examples in declassified analyses, but there's an urge, especially within the National Intelligence Council, the NIC, to give policymakers a very clear story so they can have no misunderstanding about the conclusions reached by the broader intelligence community. And this is a very laudable goal, but it's important to make sure that that need for clarity is balanced with a need for incisive analysis. It's very, very reasonable for informed analysts to reach different conclusions based on the same grouping of information. In intelligence, especially in strategic intelligence, you never get a clear picture. And most often, in most cases, you never know whether or not you're right, even after you come to that analytic conclusion, unless, of course, you invade the country and get to check out all the bunkers. Beyond that, most of the time, you never really find out that you're right in the first place. Not the preferred technique. And really, so the analytic leadership from the NIC is necessary to make sure that reasonable, incisive dissent is highlighted and preserved. And this really comes to what role the NIC is going to play in strategic analysis. Some see the NIC as the lead analyst, the senior analyst, the senior expert on a given issue. Others see it more as a leading collaborative organization, a leading collaborator that brings together all these different viewpoints from throughout the community, throughout the different agencies in the intelligence community, to make sure that their opinions are well informed, that their opinions are clear, but also to make sure that whatever disagreement there is, if reasonable and reasoned, is highlighted and not pushed away. The second, I think this is something that the intelligence community is actually very bad at, is the need for political sensitivity and awareness in its analysis. A few years ago, a national intelligence estimate on Iran's nuclear program was declassified, or portions of it were declassified. And the press and politicians focused on specific passages of that NIE that I would argue were not written with tremendous sensitivity to political issues in Washington. And if these NIEs are going to be declassified in this way, which I think is up to the leadership and something that we need to, as analysts at least, be prepared for, they need to be written in such a way so that if it's declassified, it can't be cherry-picked, and it can't be used in such a way that's counter to what the conclusions were actually intending to be. Third point just wanted to give you some ideas for analytic challenges that Ambassador Negroponte hinted at as well. Give you an idea of some of the challenges that strategic analysts confront. One of the most difficult phenomenon for strategic analysis is when a subject's behavior stays the same, but the reason for that behavior changes. That's a very difficult phenomenon to tell in an imperfect world with imperfect information. An example of that is being Saddam Hussein's WMD programs. In the 80s and 90s, he behaved in a certain way because he did have WMD. Towards the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, he behaved in exactly the same way, like he had weapons of mass destruction, but in this case, it was for a completely different reason. Instead of because he had it, it was because he wanted everyone to think he had it for deterrence and dissuasion purposes. Figuring out the difference between acting the same way for different motivations is a very difficult analytic challenge. Ambassador Negroponte talked about the need to bring in all sources of information. And I think this is a very important point. In the intelligence community, there's an emphasis on classified information over open source information, that somehow classified information is more useful or more accurate than open source information, when in reality, if you think behind the reporting into what that information actually is, there's no reason to believe that that information is more or less accurate than open source information. For example, a human intelligence report, really is just one person talking to another person. A piece of image intelligence, is really just a picture from a satellite or from a plane. What that actually means is open to interpretation. It can either, for example, be a truck or it could be a WMD laboratory. It's really in the interpretation. That's the key. As an analyst, one of the challenges that you continually face is when the policymaker that you're informing is an expert on the area that you're analyzing. When they're very experienced and knowledgeable, it's a real bonus. It lets you talk about some of the real nitty-gritty issues. But the real danger is leaders who are not experts but consider themselves to be experts. For example, I was a China analyst. They were in China in 1982, and all of their understanding and belief on China is still based on their experiences for a week in 1982. Getting through that can be a real challenge. And lastly, I think a very important point is on the issue of prediction, as Andrew talked about, is that's the real value of intelligence, be it operational, tactical, or strategic. Not what happened last week, but what's going to happen next week, next month, next year. That's going to be the real challenge, the real value added of intelligence. And there's a tendency in intelligence to predict the straight line, to predict that the status quo will continue. That's the easy analysis to make, primarily because the status quo is right now and it's continued for a reason, and those reasons probably won't change. But one of the things I was able to learn primarily under Jim Shin, both at the NIC and in OSD policy, is the need to examine the potential for change. Jim would often talk about the phenomenon of the black swan. Predictable unpredictability is the other thing. The other way he would talk about it, when things will change. Life does not occur on a straight line. And figuring out what are those potential avenues for change, what is going to affect it one way or another to change one way or direction or the other, and when that change will take place, is critically important for the intelligence community, and something that they don't do a terribly good job of doing, as we've seen in the past. And to really, this is a very important point, so I want to be able to talk about it with an anecdote. And since I focused on China and North Korea, the anecdote that I got approved by my organization is the continued debate over the death of